Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video, I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on the most recently released Savage tier for Final Fantasy XIV, the Arcadian Cruiserweight division. As of the recording of this video, I have completed all 4 of the encounters, and I have a decent amount to say. While I do also do a video where I break down my progression on each fight, talk about the strategies we used, how we identified them, full breakdowns on absolutely every encounter and angle, a very long video. I will be doing that video, but this video is just going to be my overall thoughts, just picking on little tidbits and actually appreciating or criticizing certain design aspects of each of the encounters. Now, as someone who has played every single raid tier in Final Fantasy XIV, whether they be 8-player Savages, Baldessian Arsenals, Delubrum Savages, Criterions, whatever, I gotta say, I think this is the best raid tier that we've had in Final Fantasy XIV in a very long time. I would put it up there with Eden's Promise, potentially even better than Eden's Promise, which would have been my kind of second best raid tier prior to this. The only raid that I really hold in higher regards than Eden's Promise before this is Midas, but Midas kind of comes from a different time where raiding more catered to only casual players and was not more accessible. Creator and onward is really when that began, so I like to kind of separate the two categories, and honestly, this is kind of even up there with Midas for me. Not quite on that level, but kind of up there for me as well, which is surprising given that Midas just, I think it was a more masterful design that honestly they could just copy paste Midas, release it nowadays, and people would probably love it because it was way ahead of its time. But yeah, they just really knocked it out of the park with this entire tier. I like to say that this tier has the highest amount of creative competence that we've seen out of the dev team in a long time. Now, by creative competence, I mean that it has new ideas or returning ideas that functionally work, that are actually fun and engaging and aren't like creative flops like we've had with other things in Final Fantasy XIV's dev cycle. And a lot of the things that we saw in this tier, myself included, basically went, oh, they just don't do that in raids. And then they did do these things, and it was a genuine shock that really made the week 1 experience more engaging, and I think will also not hinder the raid as time goes forward, and I'll be getting into that a little bit. Now, while that's a lot of praise, I do need to explain how each individual encounter kind of plays into that thought process. So I'm going to go through each fight and give you again a general thought process on how each of them panned out, especially in Prague in week 1. So first we start with M5S against Dancing Green, and honestly, this is the most standard Final Fantasy XIV fight of the 4. It takes a lot of stuff from normal mode that you recognize, adds a few more things in, you know, it's got role-based mechanics, it's got light parties, it's got spreads, it's got pairs. Basically, we expect them to add that kind of stuff when going from a normal to a Savage, and they do that here. And it's in kind of just a fun and thematic way. I really think that this is just more of a thematic win than it is necessarily displaying that creative competence that I mentioned earlier in the video. It just forgoes the idea of the devs like being like, oh, we want to try completely new things that, like, you know, we just can't be worried about like small criticisms from some people. We just have to be willing to try. It doesn't really do that. It just focuses on a really fun and cohesive theme that you're kind of just dancing with the rest of your party. All of your mechanics have an effective dance partner where you two kind of have to share certain responsibilities, but you're not necessarily doing them at the same time. And you're all just kind of moving constantly between one position and another position. A lot of movement heavy stuff, which does exhibit some of the things that people were expecting to see, but doesn't necessarily like break the rules in terms of how Final Fantasy XIV is designed. It definitely made some of your average players kind of go, oh my goodness, no, this is the speed we're working at now. And that, I think, is probably a good thing, because getting them used to that in a much easier environment with the first fight allows them to better prepare themselves for some of the environments that will come later. Now, one thing is, because it is a, quote, standard Final Fantasy XIV fight, you know, it doesn't really break too many norms and just has a lot of really cool thematic visuals. It actually does have some commonplace problems, such as the healing and tank roles not really feeling like they're standout at all. There are obviously spots where mitigation and healing play a role, and there are tank busters, but the tanks and the healers are kind of just doing the same exact thing as every other player, and the whole blue DPS, green DPS meme kind of just comes to fruition here, more so than it does in the other fights, especially in a week 1 scenario. But it being focused on being a giant dance party is conveyed really well, and I think actually overcomes the fight shortcomings that have just become so commonplace in Final Fantasy XIV endgame design. It's nice to know that while there are role-based mechanics, there's this constant, oh, I gotta be making sure I look at the frogs, I gotta be making sure that I look at the boss, I gotta keep track of the in-out while also keeping track of where the cleaves are, you know, I gotta remember the A-side, B-side thing. These are all, like, again, really commonplace 14 things that just, because of the speed at which they're taking place, because of the amount of movement involved in them, just get you more engaged with the encounter as a whole. There's very few long stretches of time in this fight where you're kind of waiting for something to happen, and because of that, it becomes a very, very high tier first encounter that just gets people who are already comfortable with Final Fantasy XIV through the door initially. So basically, it's just a lot of fun, and to have a tier start that way is always good. But there is a fear with that as well. Final Fantasy XIV's second raid tier. Every expansion has 3 raid tiers, 3 Savage tiers in particular that are like standard. A 0.0 raid, or a 0.05 if you will, a 0.2 raid, and a 0.4 raid. And the Arcadian releases in those 3 parts, the lightweight, the cruiserweight, and what will eventually be the heavyweight division. And the second tier has always been kind of cursed. It's a little harder than the first tier, and I do think that is conveyed here even in just the first fight. But the encounter design ends up being a little bit more all over the place. The third encounter in particular tends to be not great. Most would argue that P7, O7, E7, they're not the highest caliber fight. O7, quite a few people do like. That would be Guardian back in the Sigmascape, but it's definitely not one of the more beloved encounters. People would look at something more like Halicarnassus in the Deltascape as a really exemplary third fight, whereas Guardian, some people just like and some people don't. In my opinion, since Midas, there hasn't been a second tier with a good third fight, and I think All Thoughts is probably the best third fight that's ever been had. But it means that the first fight being good in a second tier like this kind of doesn't mean anything, because everyone's like pretty hard focused on the second and third encounters first, and then they think about the last encounter later. So this kind of just meets the bar of what we've come to expect from those second tier first fights, and does it really well in a way that more exemplifies Dawn Trail design. But we need to talk about the rest of the fights, because those are where I think the dev team actually shined in this tier, which is surprising from a second tier. Now, when we come to M6S, this will probably be the most talked about encounter, at least for the next several weeks. It's a fight that simultaneously focuses on things Final Fantasy XIV already does in its endgame design, while also setting the goal of defying expectations by returning to older fight design and trying newer things as a whole. Some phases on the surface are basic Final Fantasy XIV dances, largely the sugarscapes. You know, they added spreads, stacks, towers. Again, that's all stuff we've seen a million times before, but between these executions of very normal things are very fight-specific skill sets that you have to develop. There are tank busters that are semi-random on which tank needs to stand close to the boss and which tank needs to stand far. Your party position plays a crucial role in that, and while they have done tank busters like that before, they don't regularly do it, and they don't regularly do it in second encounters. In fact, second encounters with really annoying tank busters kind of have a really bad reputation looking back at Midgardsormr. That being said, this one actually works really well. Now, on top of that, there's a lot of player agency on boss mechanic placement because of painting the individual players. This allows you to shake up the ways that you actually engage with the sugarscapes, which, while not entirely just copy-pasted from normal mode, are largely similar to them. So by giving the players the tools to actually affect the way that those mechanics and their outcomes are resolved, gives you, again, a bit more engagement in the fight. It still does boil down to, yes, these players should stand here, these players should stand there, and that will resolve the mechanic. But by creating situations that emulate more player engagement, you just get the player more invested in what they're actually doing. And I do think that even for the more basic stuff, that's done very well here. That being said, I think we all know the big surprise that came out of M6S, and that was an honest to God's ad phase. Now, in Final Fantasy XIV, we've come to expect ad phases to go a certain way. The boss disappears, a few targets appear, maybe you got to keep the targets separated, maybe you have to like do something else in between. You know, honestly, they just kind of, we see the ad phase and it's almost solved the moment you see it. Like that's how like standard ad phases have got. We haven't had a real ad phase since more like A Realm Reborn in Heavensward days, where lots of waves of enemies come out. They all have different rules and enrage properties. They have maybe different crowd controls that are required. And your goal is to figure out how to best handle them without being overwhelmed and without doing it at such a pace that's too slow for you to keep up with the rate at which the next things will spawn or the individual mobs themselves were enraged. This is a masterclass on how Final Fantasy XIV can do ad phases with several micro enrage or positional checks that cascade out of control if not handled properly or outright wipe the party if they're too slow. It accomplishes granting player agency on how it's completed while simultaneously exhibiting something 14 really likes to do, and that's guiding the player to the answer. By creating lots of those micro enrages or fail states, you create situations that can be solved in less and less ways. So it starts really overwhelming when you see it and then gradually makes more and more sense without actually taking away the executional depth of what you're doing. Having to consider the rate at which the moves will enrage, how long you have for the gimme cat and how easy it is to kill, even baiting it onto specific targets to increase your cleave amount, the Yan auto attack damage building up on the tank and the distance that it has to keep from the moves while you're resolving the other mechanics, running out of space on the arena because of the stingrays, the healers being locked down by the Jabberwock, and the space you leave open to them with the stingray AoEs. They all play crucial roles within each other, also while the boss is targetable the whole time and auto-attacking a tank. So there's a constant pressure on both tanks in order to manage their short cooldowns and space out their long cooldowns, while the rest of the party is able to put away all of these ads, having the range deal with the gimme cats, making sure that the party can converge on Yans and kill them while not leaving the moves alive for too long. It forces the player's skill that we have to adapt to a new environment, because most players nowadays don't really have to consider how quickly they can target opponents, what target order they have. Are they skipping GCDs in order to actually make sure they do it? I know I did in the early weeks just to make sure I didn't miss a very specific GCD to actually claim a target to make sure it didn't kind of go wild. The big thing is that for a week one experience, it is something that is exemplary amongst hardcore raiders. It is the kind of thing that players like me look for in a week one experience. But that sometimes comes with the problem of not aging well over the course of adding gear, where it doesn't get easier for players who are struggling with doing it, but gets easier for players who've already mastered it, and then actually gets kind of boring in a sense. What will actually most likely happen here, and this is a bit of foresight based on my experience with this phase, players who have already mastered it will be somewhat relieved that they can actually optimize it in new ways. Finding ways to create more cleave opportunities to kill the boss faster is likely to be something that reinvigorates speed killing raid groups somewhere down the line, something that has largely died off since I believe the Shadowbringers days. On top of that, your average raider, somebody who maybe goes into the PF or just isn't someone who they themselves would consider an exemplary or above board player, above average player, I suppose, this gets a lot easier for them to execute on week to week while sticking to a traditional plan that's been laid out by guide makers or players that came before them. So the difficulty curve of the fight does scale a lot better with gear, which is something that doesn't actually happen in most cases. Some people think that maybe they need to make adjustments to this phase, but the adjustment is that your gear will make it significantly easier over time, which will give you a better sense of progression and better motivate progression amongst players who are looking to that loot week to week, who are looking at those tomestones week to week, and who may want to take multiple jobs through this fight and how their gear is going to affect the speed of that. So I think all of that is an incredibly valuable experience to have within your raid tiers to increase the value of the loot that people are actually fighting for in the first place. It just really is a masterclass phase. And between the actual well-executed, but far more traditional things like the sugarscapes and the other mechanics in the fight, I think we have one of the best second fights we've had in a long time, and one of the best raid fights we've had in a long time, period. Don't be surprised if many people put this at the top of their tier list for the entirety of the Arcadian when the time comes to grade all 12 of the Arcadian Savage fights. However, the second encounter is one that we actually are kind of coin flippy on. We expect them to maybe be good, maybe not so good, but we just kind of expect them to be in the middle somewhere. It's pretty weird how much our expectations have been laid out by that, and the fact that this is exemplary is great. But there is a specific curse that I mentioned earlier, in that the third fight of the second tier is a lot of the times either absolutely hated or just not like a big favorite amongst people. Again, since Midas, were all thoughts was genuinely one of the best fights in that entire tier. So M7 had a lot to stand up against. It had a normal mode that a lot of people were saying was way faster paced and way more engaging than most normal modes. So what were they going to do with Savage? You know, was it going to be able to keep to that same pace? Was it going to be able to have that same reputation? And was it going to be an engaging and fun experience, which classically the third fight in the second tier just hasn't been? And it was chock full of surprises. I myself predicted that they would only do the arena at the end because the dev team just doesn't do lots of arena changes. They have lots of reasons for having done that in the past, and they really haven't done it in a long time. They completely keep all the normal mode arena changes, the mechanics that are generally present in each of them, and the same kind of fight cadence that normal mode has, which was a genuine shock and absolutely welcome. I want them to feel like they can do things like this with fight design because it is absolutely a more engaging progression experience and a more exciting and exhilarating experience when we don't just expect things to be reduced down to the bare minimum like the final arena. Even if we can come to expect that they will do this more often, it won't change the fact that it's a way more engaging fight process to go through it. Now, I also mentioned that it follows the fight cadence of normal mode, and it's actually almost like a normal mode plus. Like, you can almost see exactly where they decided to strip things away from Savage to normal, which is how they generally design these fights. They start with the Savage encounter and then work backwards for normal. They've said that themselves before. Here, it feels like they did that, but in a far more, how do I put it, effective way to maintain the fight under the Savage difficulty. The literal exact cadence of normal mode plus a few mechanics happens here, and it does not in any way take away from the surprises, from the challenge. It makes the progression for this definitely a lot faster than M6 because you know what to expect, even though some of it's going to be brand new in the way it works. And it does largely use a lot of the same mechanics throughout while adding certain restraints that make them harder to resolve. But the fact that it is largely derivative off normal and provides a fun and adequate challenge while creating a great environment is a huge win. Because it means that A, the normal modes themselves can prove to be more interesting, and the Savage modes can retain more interesting elements. I mentioned Halicarnassus earlier, and Halicarnassus in normal mode has what's called the sand maze mechanic, where you have to find the exit to the maze just through a basic, look through the path and enter the sand. It's not that dissimilar from the last boss of Tender Valley in that sense, but they completely excluded that mechanic from Savage, and a lot of people wish they hadn't. And that's kind of become the standard of just expecting things like that to go away. And this fight completely breaks that convention, which means that we no longer have to do that. So it sets a very important precedent. And again, it is just a really fun fight. It also has a relatively even difficulty curve throughout, something the previous two fights actually don't have. Dancing Green and Sugar Riot both kind of peak really hard in the middle and then get a little bit easier in their back half. In fact, I'd say a lot easier in the back half of those fights. This fight, I think, does get easier towards the very end, and that's not that surprising. That happens in most encounters. But as you progress through the arenas and new mechanics are added and the amount of executional depth is increased between the seed drops and where the AoEs hit and what's being asked of your movement, etc., etc., I think the difficulty curve stays pretty even or slightly increases all the way up until close to the last 15% of the fight. So all in all, they just they broke the curse. This is a third fight that is really fun week 1 that will probably only get better to execute on because there's a lot of player skill and player agency in how some of these mechanics look. And thus, as more players get more time at it and think about it better, outside of the week 1 environment, it will get better for other players as well. It'll get better for those players even, while not really taking away from the fun and executional rules that still take place in the fight. So that's it. Verdicts in from me. They broke the curse. This is a good second tier third fight. I don't think it's as good as M6, but I think it's just because it doesn't surprise quite as much. But it sets an important precedent going forward and gets definitely another double thumbs up from me. And then you get to M8S. Now, M8S is definitely a mix of both a very good thematic fight in that it is largely a conventional Final Fantasy XIV fight, but still manages to, I guess, it focuses more on the theme. Very much like I said with Dancing Green, where it felt more like it was a thematic win. But at the same time exhibits an incredibly creative encounter design towards the back half. The first phase feels lightning fast, which is a very character-specific trait that's established even in the normal mode. You basically only ever have 2 or 3 seconds to read a lot of the movements that the boss is making and get into a very precise position that caused a lot of grief in progression, where the tanks had to rush through specific locations to prevent killing other people, and the party had to be able to understand their orientation of the boss versus where it was going in the arena and react to one of 3 potential locations and figure out the fastest path through. Expedience ended up being of great value for that reason. Sprint would be of great value for the same reason. And it really rewards players who are very quick at pattern recognition, both from a shot calling perspective, like I took on for the first phase, and from just a progression statistic and being able to explain it to other people based on really simple patterns. Like, let's say in the back half of the first phase, there's a part where he does Beckon Moonlight, which are a bunch of half-room AoEs. There are a lot of patterns that can take place, but our team was able to basically forego the majority of the patterns we were relying on early and just kind of go back down to basics and focus on an easier to execute actual strategy. And we ended up coming up with a strat that basically allowed 7 players to have a nigh on static position throughout these half-room cleaves, with 1 player who understood each of the patterns better being able to adjust to everyone else. So with 7 players being, super able to do it, you have the choice of going through pattern recognition, being able to notice that if the first and third cleaves match, that basically means 1/2 of the room is always going to be safe. And then you just look at the other 2 to see if there's any swaps. You can do that, or you can forego it and just be able to identify basic spots plus movement for just 1 or 2 people throughout the entire thing. But the speed at which you have to do all of this and then react to follow-up mechanics and react to boss cast bars, it is just a lightning fast phase that I think will adequately train players for future fight design. And I think it's essential that players actually participate in this and M6 to understand things that can happen in the future. Final Fantasy XIV is very much about increasing your repertoire of experience and knowledge. So when you see something similar to it in the future, which is bound to happen eventually, that you can basically identify it back and use that as a tool to help solve. Because of the pace of those 2 fights, and M8 especially, it is, I think, an essential encounter for players to get to and understand and get the pattern recognition bits down, especially in the first phase. However, the second phase goes back to that creative competence. Now, a lot of people argued whether we were going to get a door boss or a full phase fight, and I honestly couldn't say. There was no obvious signs that it was or wasn't going to be a door boss, but we could definitely tell in normal mode that the first phase felt a bit over-neutered, which usually does mean a door boss is in place. It just feels like there's so much fight missing that there's no way it could be everything, and that they will need to do some sort of, big old transformation to a wall boss. Like, you just kind of get that vibes from normal, but you can't ever say it definitively. They finally decided to hide the phase 2 arena and gave us a very door boss-esque experience without actually doing one, which actually is my favorite way of them deciding to handle it. The second phase is unlike most of the Savage bosses we've had before. Normally, when we go from a big phase 1 to a transformative phase 2, whether there's a checkpoint or not, we often either get a big wall boss or we get a small transformation. You know, we have E8S Shiva, we have O8S Kefka as bosses that transform but are still targetable within the arena. But then you also have Justice going into Brute Justice, but then you look at some of the other ones, X-Death and the Neo X-Death. I guess you also have Omega MNF into Final Omega. That's another one where the boss is still targetable. But I mean, we've had like, you know, E4S Titan, we've had P8S, we had, you know, we just had M4S. Like a lot of people kind of expect wall bosses, and it's a little bit memed on, you know, like P8, what is it? P8, P12, P4 doesn't do it, and it's really appreciated, but it's just like people don't know which we're going to get. We ended up getting kind of neither. We got more of like a donut style boss where the boss is in the center of an arena, or in this case, 5 separate arenas, and you're kind of just rotating around them and using this position for the movement. We only have gotten bosses like this in either Chaotic, which just came out a few months ago, or something like BA, you know, where you have the Ozma encounter. Now, of course, it also shows up in 24-mans. A lot of people will point to Thunder God Sid, for example, or the original Ozma as fights that do this. But in terms of Savage, it's just not something they really do. And if they did, which I predicted this would be a donut boss, I would have expected one solid arena, but they also introduced the teleporter mechanic, which quickly teleports you between the arenas at the cost of, you guessed it, you're technically not able to do actions while you're teleporting. So they're using that whole we're not afraid to interrupt your ability to do your rotation to make you do something, and using it to create more interesting arenas and arena mechanics. And that is, again, I think a big win for Final Fantasy XIV players and raiders across the board. Now, the actual mechanics in the second phase are a little derivative off the first phase, but also a little bit easier on average, I would say. And this is normal. When they do ultra long encounters like this, usually they start kind of front loaded. The first phases are really fast and really tight. And then the second phases are a little bit more puzzly. They put something in front of you that's kind of non-standard and expect you to solve it, whether that's P8S having the phase 1 ultra high execution door boss into the very puzzly DNA style mechanic in the second boss, or if it's even like Shiva, who phase 1 feeds you against Light Rampant and incredibly intense ad phase, but then in the second phase has things like, you know, Worm's Lament and Icelet, which are not generally considered to be the tougher mechanics in that fight. That's just generally how it goes, because in really long encounters, or when they know that you have a total combined encounter time that gets really, really long, that they don't want to overstress the player knowing that they're going to have to fight for either 13 or 14 minutes straight, or potentially 16 or 17 minutes between 2 encounters. And while that's true here, they focus more on flexing the actual identity of the arena and the 5 different platforms that you have. And I think that works in a way that keeps it, again, engaging, fast, and fun. The 14 minutes just fly by in a matter of like 5, as it feels when you're doing this fight. The only thing that really indicates to you how it's going and how much time has actually passed is when you look at the instance timer after a wipe. And that's a great feeling. You don't want to feel like you're slogging through a 14-minute fight. You want to feel like almost no time at all passed, and you just want to get on to that next pull after you've had a late wipe. And that is just done very well here. And the teleporters, they also use as a mechanic, not just to get between the platforms, but by using them as a methods of limiting your movement as well. When your only option of getting on or off a platform is a teleporter, and then they delay how frequently you can use them, it forces your decision making around the teleporting to be a lot more precise. And they do that multiple times throughout the fight, while forcing very specific positions on all of the players under those same circumstances. So the fact that they were willing to focus on a fight that was so arena based while giving us this giant boss in the center is, again, just something that flexes the creative muscles that they just haven't done before and don't usually do. So M8S, a very, very good final encounter, challenging, adequately challenging for a second tier, solid DPS check in the first phase that leads into a mildly more lenient second phase DPS check that still puts you under a lot of stress. The enrage sequence of gradually destroying the platforms while giving player agency to how it actually occurs is another really important bit. The towers target a random player, so if your players aren't uniform in their movement around the boss, I moved early, for example, on our clear. If the boss had picked me for the tower, I actually would have wiped the group, because you could actually do the towers out of an order that's just clockwise or counterclockwise and just murder everyone. So it forces you to move quick but be patient while doing MIT plans and choosing whether or not you want to do something like tank invulns or tank cooldowning a tower. I do think that's actually going to be some of the more popular ways to do it, but I think it'll be a matter of the party taking 2 towers, tanks taking 1, and then invulning 1 each at some point. But this is just, again, a masterclass tier. The negatives I have to express about any of the individual encounters, such as their second halves maybe being a little too easy, are, again, not that surprising. Wicked Thunder was notorious for the second half being much, much easier, especially the actual DPS check itself. And yet that didn't really make that encounter any worse. It was just a surprising turn. And this doesn't go quite to that extreme in week 1 gear, but it will gradually, of course, get better as more and more gear comes out. It also has another ad phase, and I didn't even mention that with M7 either, but there's ads in M7 that have specific mechanics. Silences, using them as line of sight, combined with the tether mechanic in M7 is a great use of the ads that takes a lot of like little movements and trust in order to get right. And then in M8, it has its own dedicated, almost turn 11 Kalia style ad phase, where you have to manage debuffs and manage the head's HP in such a way that doesn't wipe you. There's baits, there's tank busters. And realistically, the only major flaw in the entire tier is actually present in M8S's head phase. While it's creative and fun, it's also incredibly easy to punish the player for overgearing, just because of the way that killing a head will blow up the orb or cube if they are still alive and there's any debuffs still around, which, if the players already have a magic vuln on, is going to cause a lot of problems. So I do expect that to be the one pain point that they maybe didn't consider all the way through, and could probably look back on and still remember that there are important lessons about punishing overgearing or over DPSing in a phase like that, especially when you know if week 1 it's a problem, it becomes a much bigger problem as the weeks go on. So that is like, those are criticisms to have: the easier second phase, the very prone to easy wiping ad phase in M8S. But that doesn't take away from them taking some chances, and I think succeeding pretty much every time, to give us a very interesting, moderately challenging, even for hardcore raiders because of it testing new skills, raid tier that will age well amongst other players, even if it causes headaches early on. Players who decide to improve and get past it in the earlier weeks instead of just waiting for the gear buff are going to become more exemplary players because of it. And the players who do wait for the gear buff will still get to enjoy the same content as everybody else. So just collect your gear week to week. Know that it's even more valuable here than I think it is in your average tier, and your performance can have a significant outcome on any of these fights on an individual level, because they will overcome any of the things like damage downs or deaths that other players are experiencing. And those ads are going to die fast, so you don't have to worry to get beaten up by the Yan. Whew! So, raid tier's a W. I can't wait to talk about this at the end of the expansion after the heavyweight tier, because at this rate, if the Arcadian heavyweight division does a good job, we might have one of the most successful raids across the entirety of Final Fantasy XIV from beginning to end. And that is a shocking bit, but now we're 2/3 through, and I'm feeling it. They just need to nail one more entire tier, and I will give the Arcadian the new best raid series in Final Fantasy XIV stamp. Whether it be because the Savage is just masterfully executed, decided to push the buttons on things they have stopped doing or have never done in Final Fantasy XIV before in terms of mechanics, but also it reflects well in the normal modes and the story, which, while not super relevant to me talking about the Savage thoughts, having such a significant impact on how it's all done. The fact that the story is basically a mix of a wrestling show while also showcasing parallels to covering things like PED usage and the abuse of talent that has very often been criticized over the decades for organizations like the WWE. It's just such a well done bit that really adds to the tension and the character connection that we have, especially in Savage. If you're super into the normal mode characters and what they're going through, especially because we're so involved with all of them outside of the encounters themselves, then that makes the Savage mode encounter connections that much better, and it makes them being good encounters feel better as a player. So it does eventually wrap back around to me as a player who is a full-blown story enjoyer on top of a Savage Raider. So just W's across the board, and I'm really hoping they nail it for the heavyweight division. But that's going to be a wrap for this video, talking about the Arcadian Cruiserweight Savage tier and my thoughts on it. Keep an eye out for an even longer video where I break down every single encounter and talk about how those encounters, how we progress those encounters, how I would have done things different, what we talked about doing differently, and things that I think that other players could do to make them easier. With that, thank you for watching. I will see all of you in the next video, and until then, take care.